It's Saturday, June 28th, 2025, and we have two main risk areas today. One up here in the northern plains up into the Midwest, and then one back here in the mid-Atlantic to northeast. Our main risk area is going to be associated with a slight risk of severe weather stretching from South Dakota into Minnesota into Wisconsin, and that's going to have an associated risk of marginal surrounding it, which pretty much extends all the way through the northern plains. And then there's going to be widespread thunderstorms across much of the central and eastern United States as well. This risk is going to be very similar to yesterday with a mostly wind and hail threat. Here's our wind threat. We have a 15% chance of severe winds out here in our northern plains to Midwest risk area. And this is going to be surrounded by an associated 5% risk of severe winds. And we also have a 5% risk of severe winds out here in our mid-Atlantic to northeast risk area. Our hail risk is going to be very similar, except there's going to be no hail risk out here in the mid-Atlantic and northeast. We have a 15% chance of hail out here in parts of the northern plains all the way up into the Midwest, and that's also going to be surrounded by an associated 5% risk of hail. And then lastly, we're going to have a 5% isolated risk of tornadoes out here in parts of central Minnesota, and that's going to be surrounded by another pretty isolated 2% chance of tornadoes, which extends through into parts of western Wisconsin. And then this area isn't quite done with severe weather yet. We have a day 2 pretty large marginal risk, which spans all the way from the central plains all the way up into the Midwest and Great Lakes region. And then we also have a slight risk, which extends from parts of Wisconsin all the way up into the northern Michigan peninsula. Here's our simulated reflectivity from our northern plains to Midwest risk area. And we can see that it's going to be pretty quiet in the afternoon, but there has been an outflow boundary laid across the region from yesterday's convection, which could be sort of instrumental in today's storms. As we move forward to storm time in the late afternoon, we're going to see an area of convergence, which is going to be from the outflow boundary up here in Minnesota. And that's going to be one of our main clusters of storms today, as well as another cluster back here in parts of western Nebraska and western South Dakota and eastern Wyoming, which is going to be associated with a low and a cold front. So right here, there we go. At about the early evening hours, we see a line of kind of broken embedded cells off in central to southern Minnesota. And we also see another line back here in parts of western Nebraska and South Dakota. And both of the initiations of these storms is going to coincide with the low-level jet, which could increase tornado potential in this line of storms right here. So this line out here in Minnesota could produce all hazards of severe weather, but this line back here in parts of Nebraska and South Dakota is going to be almost entirely hail and wind threat. So our line in Minnesota is actually going to kind of deorganize as we go further into the night and actually turn into a bit of a line back here as it pushes into Wisconsin into the night hours, bringing a mostly wind and hail threat with the threat of a couple of spin-up tornadoes possible, but pretty unlikely. And then we have just a really big cluster of storms back here in parts of South Dakota and Nebraska, which would pretty much be an entirely wind and hail threat, with the exception of a couple of storms which could possibly spawn a spin-up tornado or two from an outflow boundary left by our MCS back here, which will be over in Wisconsin by that point. And another thing to mention is that our cluster of storms back here in Nebraska and South Dakota could be capable of producing wind gusts up to 90 miles an hour. Here is our northeastern, mid-Atlantic, and southeastern risk area. We can see that here in the early hours of the day, we get some frontal activity from the northeast all the way into parts of the mid-Atlantic and southeast. And up here near New York, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey is going to be our main cluster of storms, and that will be associated with a cold front moving through the region today. And after midday into the early afternoon, it looks like this is when these storms will really mature and they will chug along all the way through the afternoon into the evening hours before they kind of fall apart. But it looks like during this time, we could see an area of possibly increased strengthening of storms down here near the southeastern corner of Pennsylvania, where we have two fronts sort of colliding, and that could possibly strengthen those storms. Back over here is just a large area of scattered storms, which if they could cluster, they could possibly become severe, but it's not super likely. Like the days before, these storms are just going to be initiated by peak heating, and we'll have a fairly unstable and moist environment to work with. Here is a weather sounding from our Minnesota cluster storms, and we have a slight curve in our hodograph. And then we have over 100 low-level helicity and nearing 20 knots of low-level shear, but our bulk shear isn't going to be super high, so storm organization could possibly be an issue with those and how long-lived those storms will actually be. We do see some light veering in our winds, but it's not a bunch. And then our lowest cloud level is going to be a little higher than we would like to see to support a tornado threat, but it could possibly be lowered as those overshooting cloud tops of our storms kind of advance in front of where our tornadoes might be, which could possibly lower it a tad bit. We have quite a bit of moisture out here, which would be enough to support all hazards of severe weather. We have some drier loft, which could possibly support a severe wind threat. Our mid-level lapse rates are going to be 8.9 Celsius decreasing per kilometer, and that's going to be coupled with a large area of Cape right here near our freezing level, which could support the threat for hail. We have a extremely juiced up atmosphere out here nearing 6,000 joules per kilogram of Cape, so very primed for storms. However, we do see a bit of a capping inversion in the lower levels of the atmosphere, and that's also illustrated here, which could be kind of a reason why our storms might struggle. And then that coupled with our low bulk shear could be a reason why storms might kind of have a hard time organizing. But we do have a precipitable water of 1.84 inches and a downdraft Cape of 1400, so storms could possibly produce that threat of severe winds tomorrow. Then our 3 Cape is nearing 100, which would support all threats of severe weather. So in summary, I definitely see tornadoes, hail, and severe winds possible out here in Minnesota tomorrow, but it could depend on how organized storms can be with that lower bulk shear and capping inversion in place. Here is a sounding from our South Dakota and Nebraska cluster of storms, and our hodograph doesn't really look conducive of a certain type of severe weather, but there are other things that would support a very strong threat of winds and possibly some large hail. Our low-level helicity is going to be pretty low. Our low-level shear is going to be pretty low, but our bulk shear is going to be nearing that 40-knot threshold, so definitely enough to organize storms and support some strong updrafts. We do see some light veering in our winds, and our lowest cloud level is going to be quite a bit high off the ground, which would support a strong wind threat. Our mid-level lapse rates are going to be 8.8 Celsius decreasing per kilometer, coupled with a decent bit of Cape up here near our freezing level, which could support that threat for hail. We also see a decent amount of moisture for this region, which could support that threat for large hail and those severe winds. We also see quite a bit of dry air aloft, which could mix in and accelerate those downdrafts and help support that threat for strong severe winds tomorrow. Our atmosphere is also going to be primed for storms at 3,000 joules per kilogram of Cape. Our precipitable water isn't going to be super high at only 0.97 inches, but our downdraft Cape is going to be nearing 1,600. And another thing is that our relative humidity is going to be pretty low at only 44%, which would enhance that evaporative cooling and would also be reason for that threat of strong severe winds tomorrow nearing 90 miles an hour. So out here in our South Dakota and Nebraska line of storms, I think the risk for tornadoes is going to be very low, and our hail risk is going to be present, but the main risk is going to be that threat of strong severe winds. Our last weather sounding is going to be out here in our northeastern risk area. Our hodograph doesn't really look special, but we do have actually surprisingly nearing 100 low-level helicity, but our low-level shear isn't going to be very high. And our bulk shear is also going to be pretty low, so storms might have an issue organizing and sustaining. Our lowest cloud level is going to be low enough to support possibly a spin-up tornado threat. And then we do have a tad bit of veering in our winds, but not that much. We do have a decent bit of Cape up here near our freezing level, although our freezing level is pretty high. But our mid-level lapse rates are going to be so low at only 6.3 Celsius per kilometer that threat for hail is pretty much zero out here, although there could be some small hail. We do have quite a bit of moisture out here, which would support that threat for all hazards of severe weather. And we do have some dry air aloft, which could possibly help to accelerate those downdrafts and help support that threat of severe winds. We have a fairly juiced up atmosphere at 3,000 joules per kilogram of Cape. We see very little capping, but confidence of storms out here is going to be pretty high. Our precipitable water is going to be 1.61 inches, and our downdraft Cape is going to be nearing 1,300, so another reason why that threat for severe winds could be realized. Then our 3 Cape is going to be over 140, which would also support that threat for possibly a couple of spin-up tornadoes and severe winds. So in summary, the main thing I'm seeing out here in our northeastern risk area is possibly the conditional threat for a couple of spin-up tornadoes, because it is along a boundary and there could be pockets of helicity, and the main threat with these storms is going to be the threat of severe winds. The last thing I'm going to look at are our 500 millibar winds. We can see that out here tomorrow we're going to see a little shortwave moving through our northeastern risk area, which could help to possibly sustain and initiate those storms. And as we move further towards initiation time out in our northern plains and Midwest risk area, we see a subtle shortwave moving through, which could also help to initiate storms out there in Minnesota and even back into our Nebraska and South Dakota risk area. Another thing to mention is that our 700 millibar winds would be pretty prevalent out here in our northeastern risk area, which could be a helper in strengthening those storms. Then we also see a little 700 millibar plume of winds out here in our Minnesota risk area, which could be a reason for that increased threat of tornadoes out there. And our last risk of severe weather tomorrow in our South Dakota and Nebraska region, we don't really see a lot of 700 millibar winds, but that short wave in that region should bring a tad bit right about there, which could also help to fuel those storms.